Devan Murugan, eNCA business editor, very busy this afternoon. Where would you like to start things? Growth is down, public sector wage bill is going up, and I see a lot of money being put aside for various social relief grants as well. Devan, all yours. Where would you like to pick it up?
Well, I think you've summed up most of it, Gareth. Good afternoon. I mean, we've had information on what's happening with the Eskom debt. We've said a few things about Transnet. We had an update on the wage bill, the social security grant. That's all come to fore. Let's just start with the big one. Eskom, well, a commitment that the government has put forward. It will take on the Eskom debt. How much? Between a third and two-thirds of that debt. But the quantum, the specifics on that debt, yet to come. Very interesting to hear from the finance minister that they will sit down. There are conditions, there are expectations from Eskom. He wants an independent sort of review of the status of Eskom, and that's also going to be a huge sort of condition attached to that taking on of Eskom's debt. The social grant issue, talks are still underway with that. The finance minister being very, very firm on the fact that the money has to come from somewhere. I want to pick up the rest of the things, including that with Isam Mahlanga. He's the chief economist at Alex Forbes. I mean, most of it expected, but I mean, overall, what's your take on all the expected big hot issues that he was supposed to speak about? Satisfying or not?
Look, it's satisfied. If you look in terms of the universal basic income grant, it's not in the budget, but there is an extension of the COVID relief grant to March 2024. It's not budgeted for beyond March 2024 to signal that it's not a permanent expenditure item in the budget. And there's a very strong commitment to say, should it be made permanent, it has to be conditional on permanent revenues that can only be financed through tax or through reprioritization. That is a good commitment. But also taking care of the critical SOEs that can boost economic growth. Transnet, Dinel, Sanral, that is very important. But finally, in terms of the commitment to resolve the e-tolls, government would take, national government would take 70% of the debt, and then the Gauteng province is going to pay 30% of the debt. Finally, that can remove one of the hanging things that we had as far as financing public infrastructure is concerned. What we need going forward is a proper structure on how future public infrastructure are going to be funded in a way that reinforces the user pay principle. The disappointment, of course, as you said in your opening, is the lack of detail as far as the debt relief to Eskom. That has been pushed out to February 2023. It's only 3 months from now. I think we are almost close. The commitment to take between a third and two-thirds is what we expected. The number that we had was 200 billion, which falls right in the middle of that third to two-thirds. I think that is going to be quite important in February.
I want to just grab one more thing before we cross over to some political reaction. It was a prudent budget, though, wasn't it? I mean, you heard some utterances, Eskom debt, for example. He says, we'll take it on, but we've got to have some independent review that we can talk to find out what's exactly happening at Eskom. Again, something an investor would want to hear. Transnet, 5.8 billion rand. If you do not sort that out, you can't get goods to ports, you can't export. That impacts on revenue. So he was specific on the fact that we're going to be prudent watching this.
Absolutely prudent. Our debt ratios peak at 71% of GDP, 2 years earlier than what the budget projected. If you look in terms of our fiscal deficit, we reach a primary budget surplus next year, and we continue with budget surpluses over the medium term. That is for the first time in 15 years. So it's really puts our fiscus on a much more sustained levels. And with the commitments that we have, I think it's achievable. But the big risk is the wage bill, because what is budgeted for is 3.1% growth per year over the medium term. Inflation is expected to be 4.8% over the medium term. It's very difficult to see unions that are going to agree over 3 years to a 3.1% when inflation is 4.8%. I think that might be a risk. But it can be covered in the expected revenue overruns over the next 3 years, such that it's not going to derail our fiscal position.
I'm going to ask you one quick one, couple of seconds here. This grant continuation, he's been very, very finicky about that, saying that, look, we don't have the money unless we raise taxes, for example. The revenue has to come from somewhere. Everyone waiting for that extension have to wait a little bit longer. He hasn't mentioned any extension of any grant.
No, that has not been mentioned. But if we're referring to the social relief of distress, it has been extended by 1 more year to March 2024.
Yeah, the
but
basic
beyond
income.
that, it's not budgeted for.
Well, Issa Mhlanga, the chief economist at Alex Forbes, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I'm going to leave it there for now. I want to hand over to Rofhiwa Madzena, who's got some political reaction for us. Rofhiwa.
Thank you very much, Devan. Indeed, an interesting speech, or statement rather, delivered by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. I've got Brett Herron from the Good Party, who's going to share the party's insights on what they heard from the Minister this afternoon. Brett, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. What were some of the important things that came out of the speech today that give a clear indication of what we're going to be seeing at the national budget in February?
I think for us, one of the most important things was the clear communication that the social relief of distress grant, social distress relief grant would be extended by another year. But obviously that's not the solution. The solution needs to be a long-term solution, providing a basic income grant. There's no way that you can now withdraw that small relief from families who've been relying on it for the last 2 years. So we welcome that extension. The commitment to conditions that are attached to any assistance, financial assistance to Eskom, are important, and we believe that those conditions must include planning for this transition, which the Minister did mention, to a green, renewable energy supply, and protecting the jobs that are currently in the energy supply space. So those two stand out for us. The commitment to strengthening the criminal justice system. There's no way that we'll ever be able to prosecute the outcomes of the Zondo Commission without the criminal justice system being properly resourced. And of course, the increased support for policing in general and attacking crime is a welcome announcement.
Mm-hmm. While we stick to matters of social welfare, he did indicate that there'd be more given to local communities and municipalities so that basic services are given to the poorest of the poor. The worry here is the oversight, which has lacked for decades now, and one wonders if government will be able to change that in terms of making sure that the money allocated is used for what it was allocated for.
Yeah, I think that, for a long time now, the Fiscus has transferred funding to local government in the form of the equitable share, which is calculated on the poverty population in each municipality. And that money is meant to support the municipality to provide free basic services. It's often not used to provide free basic services, and then the tariffs are too high, and so most people who have access to water and electricity in terms of connection don't actually have access because they can't afford the purchase. So if there's going to be increased funding for free basic services, which there should be, so we would support that, there has to be conditions attached to it that the money is allocated to free basic services.
Right. I found it quite interesting that we've got some kind of certainty and a way forward around this e-toll issue. What were your thoughts on the fact that Gauteng has committed to pay 30% of the debt and then government will settle the rest?
Well, this is, I guess, a major breakthrough or step forward in the ongoing debate around the e-toll, the Gauteng Road Improvement Project, which is the e-toll project. For a long time, the Gauteng province has said that they intend to find a way for it to scrap the e-tolling. The minister didn't say that they were scrapping the e-tolling. What he said was that the historic debt that SANRAL has accrued because people are not paying will be split between the Gauteng government and the national government 30-70. But as he said, the revenue to support that could be raised through tolling or toll booths. So I'm not sure that the e-tolling is completely resolved, but certainly the historic debt that SANRAL, an important SOE in our country, the debt that they're carrying has some solution to it, and I think we should welcome that breakthrough.
And then finally, your thoughts on them taking on part of Eskom's debt so that Eskom can focus on issues around operations?
We need Eskom to stabilize, and we need a stable energy supply. And if it means that we need to assist Eskom in opening up the available cash flows that they need to maintain the infrastructure that they have and to develop new infrastructure and to transition to green energy, then I think we would support government stepping in and saying we'll provide some relief to Eskom. Obviously, the relief to some of the other state-owned entities raises some eyebrows. Transnet is an important SOE and should be assisted. The support to Denel is questionable, and the support to SANRAL, I think, is welcome. But taking on some of Eskom's debt in order to stabilize our electricity supply is something that we should welcome.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Brett. That is a Good Party's Brett Herron joining us to talk about the Good Party's view on some of the insights that came out of the statement delivered by the Minister just a few moments ago, concluding. I'm going to hand it back to Devan Murugan, who has got Matthew Parks, COSATU's Matthew Parks, standing by for their reaction to the statement.
Yeah, well, thanks very much indeed, Rofhiwa. I mean, one of the big issues ahead of this budget was whether or not government can contain the wage bill. The unions and organised labour, of course, saying that, nope, look, we've got to earn a decent wage, and what it was on the table in this entire wage negotiating process was not enough. But we've got a decision on that. I'm going to ask Matthew Parks from COSATU what he thinks of it. So, I mean, largely expected, and I want to start very quickly with the wage bill. It was the huge the huge topic on wages ahead of this budget. 3%, and it looks like that's where it stands. Of course, the negotiations on the wage increase, I don't think have ended, but just your quick reaction, it looks like some sort of finality that's on the table then as far as government's offer is concerned. What's your take on the numbers that you saw as far as the wage increase is concerned in this budget, Matthew?
So, look, we don't think it's final because there's a mediation process now that's going to begin at the CCMA starting from Friday. Government will be there, Labour will be there. We have to find each other. The government has to negotiate. So the ministers put there the government offer, which is the 3% baseline, the 1.5% cost of living adjustment, the 1,000 rand cash gratuity after tax. We hope we can find each other at the CCMA engagements. Negotiation requires government to engage in good faith, but we think also it is correct for public servants to expect to have their wages protected from inflation. Public servants didn't get an increase in 2020. Inflation has badly eroded their capacity. Most public servants, like all other workers, are drowning in debt trying to take care of their families. Government has been lauding nurses and police officers, doctors, teachers for keeping the country moving over the past 2 years of COVID, for keeping the country safe. We think the least we can do is to afford them a living wage, to protect the wages from inflation, and let's rebuild the collective bargaining negotiation, which was quite badly damaged by the previous Minister of Finance, who refused to negotiate at all.
What do you make of the other sort of peripheral contributions that went to bridges, for example, building schools, there's some contributions towards the health sector, whatever. Down the line, does that make a sizable difference to the people's living?
Look, we have to address many issues. Public service, like all the workers, depend upon the public services government provides. But those themselves are being eroded because of austerity budget cuts. If you look at the budget allocations for health, for education, for tertiary education, for transport, it's constantly being eroded, making it more difficult to provide quality service that workers depend upon. Workers have to queue from 4 in the morning at public hospitals. It makes it very difficult. Workers have to queue from 5 in the morning at Home Affairs offices to get their IDs. So we need to see a much more coherent approach to the budget. We don't think government should be outsourcing the bill for corruption and state capture, mismanagement, and a stagnant economy to nurses. We should address the real cause of the fiscal crisis, which is a stagnant economy. It's high levels of unemployment. It's the billions we lose to corruption, to wasteful expenditure. It's Eskom, which is constantly load shedding because of old generation capacity. It's Transnet, which is not working because of cable theft. It's Metro Rail as well. So let's address those real causes. That's how you're going to grow the economy, how you'll afford to pay public servants a decent wage, how you provide public services, how you reduce the debt debt, but to simply blame the victim is not sustainable.
But it has, I mean, look, there's some sizable amounts in some of these state-owned enterprises. I mean, we had about 23 billion to Sanrail, we've got 5.8 to Transnet. Of course, they're still talking about Eskom and exactly what the quantums are there for the debt relief on that subject. What do you make of the response to the state-owned enterprises this afternoon?
So I think that's quite positive. COSATU has long been calling, like many other organizations, for scrapping of the Gauteng e-tolls. So it's good government's paying off their debt. We now need to move forward and have clarity that this thing is closed. It's very positive the government is saying that we're going to come with a debt relief package to Eskom between a third and two-thirds. We want to see it at least being 200 billion rand to really free up Eskom's resources to invest in maintenance, to ease load shedding, to invest in new generation capacity. That's critical. That's going to grow the economy. That's going to make sure companies can sell the products, pay their workers. It's going to help reduce the debt to government itself. So that's a positive thing. We need to get more detail. The reinforcement of Transnet is good, but we also need to put the law enforcement there as well, because you can pump money into Transnet and to Metro Rail if the police are not dealing with cable theft. If you don't tackle that kind of criminal syndicates, then we're going to continue to limp along.
Quite right, Matthew Parks from COSATU. Thanks very much indeed. And I think that pretty much sums up what's been happening as far as the state-owned enterprises support is concerned there. I mean, look, it's all well and good, 5.8 billion rand to Transnet. But indeed, it is a fact that if you do not sort out the peripheral issues around the crime, around the losses, cable theft around Transnet, we might be in the same position again. Let's cross over once again to Rofhiwa Madzena. She's got the Freedom Front Plus with her.
Thank you very much, Devan Murugan. Yes, indeed, the leader of the Freedom Front Plus, Peter Groenewald, joining us, and they're going to be sharing their thoughts as a party on what came out of the minister's statement this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Mr. Groenewald, and perhaps just maybe give us a sense of the general themes that you thought were important and may have been addressed well by the minister in his statement today.
Well, firstly, there are two major issues for the Freedom Front Plus. Firstly, it is the government debt that is in the increase. We're going to 4.7 trillion in rand. The service cost is 307 billion annually. So that is really a concern. And secondly, of course, is the state-owned enterprises. The government will come to a point where they seriously take a decision to privatize all state-owned enterprises. We see in this budget an additional 35 billion has been allocated to some SOEs, like, for instance, Denel is one, Transnet is one, but they don't have the final answer on Eskom. So we're not going to know what is going to happen there. But economists have calculated, if, for instance, because the minister said between a third or two-thirds of the debt. Now, the debt of Eskom, we talk of 400 billion. Let's say they're going to take care of 200 billion. That means a further 10 billion increase on interest and service debt. We cannot afford it. And we must not be misled by the windfall gain of the income as far as Treasury is concerned or revenue is concerned. We must remember that fuel costs has increased tremendously in the financial year. Inflation is up to more than 7%. That in real terms means that the people, the consumer, are paying more tax. And that's why we have this windfall gain on tax. We must not be misled. So we are quite worried still when it comes to the finances. The debt is getting out of control and the SOEs must be privatized. Can I add, if the government really wants to address an issue when it comes to Eskom, they must accept and change and amend legislation in such a way that they ring-fence all municipality incomes. When it is about Eskom or water services, they must ring-fence it that those monies paid by the consumer must pay directly for the service delivered.
Yeah. Were you encouraged by the fact that the special relief of distress grant was extended by another year? Or do you think that they should be looking for a more sustainable solution to providing income to the poorest of the poor?
Well, firstly, the Freedom Front Plus say that we cannot afford a basic income in South Africa. That's a fact. We don't have the money. The extension of another year, the question is, can we afford it, or is it part of an election campaign? for the ANC coming 2024. We will see. But what they must do, they must go and sit and ensure that there are real change in economic growth of South Africa. We must create jobs, because if we create enough jobs, you won't have this basic social grant needed. Therefore, I didn't hear really recommendations when it comes to that. Yes, there was referrals to that, but for instance, our infrastructure, do away with black economic empowerment, do away with affirmative action. Even the Zonne Commission referred to those issues, saying that if we take that away, we will be able to curb, in one certain sense, further, can I say, the theft of taxpayers' money or corruption, and that is what must happen. They must start focus on how to create jobs in South Africa so that we have an economic growth. The minister said no. They actually adjusted their future economic growth on 2.1 to 1.9. So that is quite a lot of worrying things when it comes to the government's finances. And I didn't even talk about all the corruption.
No, absolutely. But as we do talk about the corruption, surely you're encouraged by the fact that more funds will be pumped into these key institutions to bring those accountable to book.
Not much. For instance, if you look at justice, I think it's about 103 million. It's not that much. If we listen to what they say and see the whole process of ensuring that those who are part of corruption comes to book, it's going to cost more than that. So I'm not so sure. Yes, it is encouraging. At least there's a thinking that we have to assist with the budget, but I don't think it's enough. If we look at the enormous, can I say, issue of corruption in South Africa, they must get those billions back, and then maybe we will have more money to ensure that we can finance for more other things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That is Mr. Peter Groenewald. He is the leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Some positives that he's mentioned there, but a lot of work, he says, still needs to be done to provide for South Africans and to also just get the burden of the SOEs off South Africa's fiscus. I'm going to hand it back to Devan Murugan now, who's got Xolani George, will be giving us further updates on what people thought of the statements.
Yes, thanks, Rofhiwa. It's not always about Eskom and Transnet, and these huge figures are not always directed to SOEs or other pressing issues. But one other issue that is pressing, and it's the reason why we're here this afternoon at the City Hall, is the fact that we've been moved from Parliament, which was burnt down recently, and of course we're shifting venues because of that. And the Finance Minister, Enoch, bringing some relief to that as well. I want to bring in Cornelia George, he's the Parliament Secretary. Thanks very much indeed. So some cash to deal with here, but of course you've got an enormous task ahead of you to rebuild Parliament.
No, well, thank you very much. We are quite excited as Parliament that at least there is certainty emerging on the enormous work that we need to do to literally make sure that Parliament rises up again. The infrastructure that was devastated on the 2nd of January, at least we welcome that with great relief, given the fact that when we reach the unfortunate anniversary, 2nd January is coming up in the next 2 months. At least it will be possible now for the executive authority of Parliament to say to South Africans, we now have confirmed resources, more than 2 billion rand, to be able to commit to the rebuilding of the National Assembly, rebuilding of the old Assembly, but also we welcome the allocation by the Minister of Finance that given the impact of the fire in terms of its own disruption to the normal operation of Parliament. Of course, members have lost more than 495 offices. We have extensive damage to what was there in terms of infrastructure for committees to perform oversight, and also digital capacity of Parliament to make sure that it remains relevant to South Africans to drive public. All of those things were severely disrupted. So we now have an additional amount of 118 million rand, which we greatly appreciate, even though it's not adequate from what we wanted. But at least it will help us to start doing the rebuilding phase of the offices for members to make sure that what they are asking for to come back and operate physically, we will gradually restore our operating capacity. So that we are back at the bare minimum to operate physically, yet at the same time start the most difficult task of ensuring that we have capacity to manage the reconstruction of a major program.
And it's major indeed, because 2 billion rand is not a figure you just suck out of your thumb, isn't it? I mean, you've got to really analyze the damage, which was really extensive. I mean, there must have been a lot of talk between you, Treasury, and all the other stakeholders as to what's needed to get Parliament back into the shape it originally was.
Of course, it's a lot of work to undertake. Assessments have been done to look at the extensive damages that the National Assembly, which was the most highly impacted one in terms of damage to all operating, literally bent down completely. So extensive work on assessment has been done, and it gives us huge estimates to be able to do that. Of course, over the next 3 years, to start a major reconstruction project, there are many factors that will be beyond our own control, and we've got to manage those with a wide eye so that we minimize any wastages, we open our eyes vigilantly against corruption, and make sure that every cent is accounted to South Africans in a manner that we are able to restore their pride, the center of democracy of our country, the heartbeat of what our constitutional order is all about. We will be watching that and make sure that we roll down our sleeves, we roll up our sleeves as Parliament to lead this national effort of rebuilding our Parliament.
Of course, the next question is, would the next budget be in Parliament? What's the time frame like for us to be sitting in Parliament once again, listening to a Finance Minister or the State of the Nation?
Given the damage that we have and the fact that no work has been done to start the reconstruction project, we will continue using this facility in the interim, the City Hall, and over the next 3 years, it is our wish that we must be able to go back to a fully restored Parliament, and we will try our best to make sure that we're able to execute that within that period, bar anything else that may make it difficult for us to have the pride of the nation fully restored. And we will be leading that effort to make sure that we can have all what has happened to be put behind us, but of course remaining as a lesson that we must never, ever close our eyes in terms of vigilance.
Thanks very much indeed. Xolile George is the Parliament Secretary there. Once again, a reminder, the Finance Minister today saying that as far as the rebuilding of Parliament is concerned, it would be allocated 2 billion rand, another 118 million to refurbish offices and get the digital damages on track and back in track to the original sort of operation. So, thumbs up for what the Parliament had received. But I mean, when that actually kicks off might be, like you heard Xolile George saying, over the next 3 years.